Hey, what's up? Liron here. In this video, I'm going to show you a simple, straightforward way for creating depth in watercolor. A good sense of depth with foreground, middle ground, and background, and get that real feeling of aerial perspective. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so my goal here is really to dumb this down as much as possible. The reference photo isn't too complex, but I'm going a step further and really simplifying it, which is going to make this process faster and I think just easier to understand. So here's the thing. We actually have three very clear layers. You can see the mountains and the horizon in the background, you can see the buildings and maybe the city, and then the trees in the foreground. So we have very clear three layers of background, middle ground, and foreground. And this is what I'm focusing on. So I'm going to represent every one of these three layers with basically a pretty flat wash with some variation in color, but mostly the value is going to be the same. My drawing supports that in that it's fairly simplistic. So if you notice, I'm actually working on the silhouette, quote unquote, of the buildings. I'm drawing the line that represents their outline without going into too many details on what happens in the middle. The reason is, again, that I'm going to simplify these three layers, okay? Now, you want to pay attention to the vertical lines, the horizontal lines, and then the diagonal lines. So the buildings, obviously, are composed of a lot of verticals and horizontals. And then with the background, we break it off with a bit of that diagonal line of the mountain ridge. Okay, now every part of this painting will offer unique opportunities for technique. So for example, the background will offer us a unique opportunity to do a lot of wet in wet and get it to be smooth and flowy and leave it at the back. Okay, with the buildings, we're going to have a bit more wet in wet. After we put some paint in up on top of that, we can add some details, and we'll also have fine control of the outline of the buildings, adding all of those small details you see. And with the trees, we're going to have a bit of dry brush, using a lot of the water sprayer to keep the paint moving, and so on. Okay, so the drawing is done. Look at this simplicity. It is so simple. Now, the beautiful thing about these low saturation paintings is you can use whatever leftovers you have on your palette, which I have done here. I basically took a bunch of water, added it to my palette, and I'm just starting this wash. Now, I am struggling just a bit with the water capacity. It's not the brush's fault. It's actually because I should have been using a larger brush for this specific instance. Okay, I'm using the Escoda size 16, I believe. I should have probably used a larger one or a fat mop brush. Now here's the unique opportunity. Once I get to the middle of the page, I'm starting to mix a bit of a stronger paint. Now, in order to negate all the wetness on paper, it actually has to feel a little stronger. You'll see I'm taking more and more paint, and it may feel a little too thick when you mix it on the palette, but trust me, you need the strength in order for it to show. And you see it barely shows right now, which is fine. I'm not trying to get this line to be very strong. Remember, I'm trying to keep a smooth horizon line. This smoothness will contrast with the strength of the buildings and the trees, and it will be a strong component in creating that sense of depth. Okay, one more element that I'm utilizing here is the temperature, obviously. So I'm starting with a bit of gray, a bit of blue, and as I move closer, I let the warm colors dominate a little more. This isn't fully perfectly represented here because I am using a bit of blue in the foreground as well, but to some extent you can. Sorry, I lost my voice there. To some extent, you can see this. I'm gonna take a sip of my water. I'm back. So yeah, you can see me switching over to red. So it is getting warmer, but the closer I get to us, I will use a bit more blue as well to get things darker. So it's not perfect. Now, the colors I'm using very generally are French ultramarine, yellow ochre, no phthalo blue here, a bit of burnt sienna, and just a bit of Quinacridone Rose, just very little of it. But notice how much time I'm taking to darken a little more and a little more, just to make sure that it's going to show, because remember, the paper is very wet, the paint spreads out, and we will lose some of this horizon line that we've created, okay? But as long as you can see a hint of it, I'm happy. Now, if I can divert your attention to the left section, look at how soft the transition is from the sky to the land, from this gray, bluish gray to a blue. This transition is key because it does show the horizon line very well. But on the other hand, it's still super smooth as I can, as light as I can. Now notice how much work the bottom of this wash takes because I'm using darker paint. I want to get it to be as dark as I can right now because it's going to have to be darker later on. So I'm trying to save up some work from having to do it later. Okay, the paper is dry, everything is dry. Moving on to the mid-ground layer, if you will. And as I said, I'm going to treat this as one big blob of shape. Now, I find this stage to be very fun because it allows me to focus on the fun in watercolor. I don't have to be nervous about it drying because I'm using one big shape, so the shape is simple. I'm using very wet paint to get it to stay wet and to keep flowing. So it's a lot of fun. And then I can use the tip of the brush to get all these beautiful small details around the edges of the buildings. Because we're doing this in such a unified shape in a way, doing the outline of the shape in an interesting way becomes key. Okay, I hope that makes sense to you because it's kind of a silhouette, and it's another element in showing how there's this aerial perspective, an atmospheric perspective where things get a little lighter. The more we go back, they get less clear. You can't tell as many of the details in them. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So now I'm connecting this building with the building on the left, and here I have to speed up just a little bit to get everything connected and flowing together. When doing this kind of work, I think having a good brush becomes a little more important. You can get away with using two brushes simultaneously, so have two prepared, one bigger and another smaller. Then you establish the shapes with the bigger one and quickly switch to the smaller one for the edges. It is possible, and I have done it before. But if you can get a shape that both can cover a large space, this size of a wash is perfect for this brush, unlike the previous one, which I said wasn't large enough. If you can get a brush that's somewhere in this ballpark, this is size 16, you will be able to get these shapes in if it has a good tip, okay? So it's just a bit of a more comfortable way of doing it, but you can work with just two brushes if you don't have a good one or a good tip. So next to the edge, because this part is going to be pretty much swallowed up by the trees, I'm kind of fading it out. You see, I'm just using a bit of the side of the brush to fade it out. I'm spraying a bit of water on it. Just to spread it out, to not have too hard of an edge there, but it is just imaginary. You won't see this later on. And because it's covered by a significantly darker wash, it's okay, and it won't be visible. Next up, we have this building on the left, and I do want to warm it up a bit because look at it in the reference photo, it is warm. And I will attempt to connect it to the previous two buildings in some way, not necessarily physically. The washes are going to dry by then, but in concept, okay? I'm using the same process, establishing the main bulky shapes of this building, and then I'm establishing the smaller ones as well, okay, around the edges, trying to figure it out. Now my vertical lines aren't perfectly vertical. You will see me using a quick trick to fix it later on, okay? It's a fun way of doing it. So here we go, the building. I added a bit of a highlight on its left edge, even though I'm gonna add some dry brush highlights later on, okay? Which are gonna be really nice because of the hazy feeling that we created here, because we painted it in a very atmospheric way. Now, if not everything still connects for you, don't worry. Things are going to fall into context once we obviously add the foreground with the very dark trees, okay? But right now I'm just designing a few shapes for the buildings to decide. I have played around with the dimensions of the painting. It's a little more squeezed in my attempt. You see there's a little more space in the original one. That's fine. I'm not too worried about keeping the exact, width to height ratio. That doesn't matter to me at all. It's just the way I cut the paper practically. That's how I paint. So in any case, now I'm kind of thinking what I'm gonna do. I'm thinking about the next step, and I'm gonna start just mixing a bit of a darker mix here, because what I want to do is start working on the layer of the trees. So I switched to a large brush. Now, I've been asked about this brush a few times before. This is a Leonard brush, which it's interesting. I believe I purchased it in Paris. I just don't remember. It was a big art store, obviously. I don't remember ever seeing it anywhere else. Not here, and not in any other places that I visit, including Italy. It's just a strange brush in a way. I do love it. So yeah. Now, a lot of people always ask about, did I wait for a layer to dry? Is it dry now? The layer of the buildings is not fully dry, but you want to pay close attention now. I'm okay with that because I'm using such dark paint now. So do you see how the building on the left especially still hasn't dried? I just switched to this brush and started working on this layer. So I don't mind that because I'm using such dark paint. I'm actually fine with getting a few soft edges, okay? Because it's so dark and strong, it will still preserve its independence and it will still stand out, okay? So I don't worry about that. In fact, later on I realized that I actually want to achieve some smooth edges because you don't want anything that crosses the entire painting. You don't necessarily want it to be evenly dark and sharp all throughout the shape. You sometimes want to get some variation, especially for those elements that, again, cross the entire painting, whether it's a tree line like here or a side of a building. You want to get some variation in it very often, otherwise it kind of breaks the painting off into two different paintings. It's funny, we were watching this cooking contest show here in Israel, and one of the things that it got me thinking about was very similarly how the components of a dish have to work together. Because sometimes you can cook great individual components, and if they don't work well as one dish, it may feel like three separate or two separate dishes, which are fine on their own, but you don't get like a wholesome meal. So it's the same thing here. If you break it off too much and the elements don't relate to one another, it will feel maybe like two separate paintings. And how do you relate the elements together? You blend some edges, you break some boundaries between them. Okay, I hope that makes sense. That's really, I think, one of the most common ways to bring together the different parts of a painting and have them work together. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is fix the shapes I told you about. So you see how this building is leaning a bit to the right. So I'm actually just filling in that area with kind of pretending like there's either another building behind it or another part of the building to the side. And you see this is how I straightened it. Now it may not be as obvious because the paper is at an angle, but that's what I did there. And now everything is dry and I'm starting to apply my dry brushy opaque paint. Now, this is watercolor. It's not gouache, it's not acrylics, it's watercolor. I'm just using it straight out of the tube. You can use multiple paints here. I think as long as they're acid-free, it should be fine. Now, the highlights are actually playing a big role here, and you'll notice what huge difference it makes. Because of the atmosphere and the hazy feeling we've developed here, the highlights are going to play a key role in putting all the values in the right context and creating that sense of smooth, hazy, foggy even feeling. Okay, so I'm painting the sides of the buildings where I see the light hits them through I imagine that I'm painting them through the different trees and branches and bushes. And there aren't too many of them. As you see, it's just touches here and there, but these are going to play a crucial role in getting the impression we want, okay? This is a bit hard sometimes to use paint straight out of the tube because watercolor is not generally meant for it, but you will get the technique with time. Sometimes you can even dilute it with water and it will still look good. Adding this corner to the building, that's a little lighter. This isn't really, it's just catching a reflection, or it's transparent. Honestly, I'm not sure. But it's not so much about what is there, it's more about how we want to express it in these kinds of paintings. It's not super realistic, it's not, hyper detailed, none of that. It's very simple. It's the bare bones, the dumbing down of what it takes to create depth. Temperature, values, edges, that's all there is to it. Okay, and we have all of these elements here. Now I'm going to sign this and we'll remove the tape. So here's the final result. Very proud of this one. Again, it's a very effective, straightforward way just to get that sense of depth. I hope you found it helpful. With that, let's remove the tape. And I'm going to show you the final result. I do think it will be significant here due to the darkness around the bottom. And even if you don't tape it fully straight, it's okay as long as you have enough room so you can frame it and it'll still look good, but hopefully now you can see. Just very basic, using value, using colors to get that strong separation between foreground, middle ground, background, and then some of the highlights just as a final touch to get that hazy feeling of sunlight. Let me show it to you a little more up close because sometimes people ask for that. And yeah, now we can wrap it up face to face. So once again, I hope you enjoyed this one. Very straightforward. You keep the values and the colors limited in a way. You use, the darkest values up front, the lighter ones at the back. Keep things blurry where necessary. Have things a little flowy, but still quite even, and a little darker in the middle ground. And you get this beautiful effect. Especially, I like the highlights there and how they hint that it's a bit hazy and it's a bit in the distance, but you can still see some light bouncing off the building. I think that it was important in this particular example. Look at your reference, analyze the values, figure out how dark or light everything should be. Feel free to mix in advance a couple of wells that you know you're going to use that are accurate for you. And you've seen me, even with all of this preparation and everything, still I struggled to some extent with the evenness here, okay? So it takes time and a lot of effort, but you will get that technique and you will be able to calculate very easily how much water you need, how much paint you need, and so on. So with that, again, I want to thank you. If you want to learn how to paint like me, how to paint like this, how to convey things in the way you want to and express things more freely and enjoy the painting process, be sure to check out my frustration-free watercolor course. Link is always in the description box below, and I will see you again in the next vid.